Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my 2022 NFL season preview. Today, we have a big episode, not only because we are starting out in the NFC East, but we are starting with our NFC teams. As I mentioned last time, we finished covering all of the AFC teams, and now we are moving on to the NFC. And one thing I want to quickly mention about the NFC, which is in stark contrast to the AFC, is that a lot of teams in the NFC either remain the same or regressed. So a lot of the divisions are probably going to look a lot similar to how they did last year compared to a lot of the AFC teams that we talked about, just because, again, you had a lot more player movement in the AFC than the NFC. So a lot of the powerhouse teams in the NFC remained the same, whereas things got a little shook up in the AFC. So the NFC East was a really hard division to pick in certain respects. And you'll see this in a little bit here. But we're starting out with the Dallas Cowboys. Of course, the Dallas Cowboys are one of the most controversial franchise, I guess you could say, because their fans get a bad rap, their owner gets a bad rap. It seems like every single time they do good, they always fail, and that's one of the more consistent things about the Dallas Cowboys franchise is that every time you think they are off to a good start, they never have followed through, especially in the playoffs. And this was seen in the wild card round loss this past year to the San Francisco 49ers. It was a blunder by quarterback Dak Prescott that ultimately lost them that game, with him failing to get his team in proper formation and stop time so they could try to kick a field goal or go for it. And, I think, again, that just is it sort of epitomizes the frustration that NFL fans and particularly Cowboys fans have had over the past few seasons. Not only that, but the Cowboys lost two big pieces in Amari Cooper, which they traded, or who they traded to the Cleveland Browns, and Randy Gregory, who initially agreed to stay with the Dallas Cowboys, but then ultimately decided to go to the Denver Broncos. Now, I do think Gregory is a bigger loss than Amari Cooper. We'll get into that. But let's start off by seeing what they did do in the offseason. They got James Washington, who I think is going to be a serviceable third receiving option. You have to remember that their main wide receiver is going to be CeeDee Lamb at the start. I think CeeDee Lamb is going to be a huge offensive player for them. I think CeeDee Lamb is arguably a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL now. If not, he's top 15. And I think James Washington is going to be a great piece to serve as the number two while they wait for their whole receiver core to get healthy and then ultimately go to number three. Dante Fowler Jr., I'm not as big on. I think he'll be a serviceable replacement for Randy Gregory, but what I will say is when you have Micah Parsons as one of your best defensive players and DeMarcus Lawrence, you're going to be fine regardless of what happens with or without Randy Gregory. Randy Gregory was decent. I never think he was as big as some people projected him to be. But again, Dante Fowler, if you expect him to be the third head in that three-headed monster that once was, I don't think he's quite going to fill that void for you. And then Tyler Smith was an interesting pick. It's very interesting to me to see how the Dallas Cowboys have sort of shifted away from things, because they used to be known for having such a consistently good offensive line. They were known for drafting really well. And Tyler Smith was a somewhat surprise pick because their offensive line is nowhere near as good as it was when Tony Romo was leading the team with DeMarco Murray and Des Bryant. But they're better. They're better, and I think Tyler Smith is one of those potentially big hits, big misses kind of picks. And the one thing I can say positive about the Dallas Cowboys is more often than not, they will hit on those reach picks potentially than they'll miss. I'm looking at their record. Even though, as I said, they have a lot of new moving parts and they lost some key players, I don't think it's going to impact their schedule at all and their record at all. And that's why I think they're going to go 12-5 again. The question is now I think they have a legitimate competitor to win the NFC East. But will they be enough to challenge them for that number one seed? We'll have to wait and see. But again, if I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, I'm feeling fairly optimistic heading into this next season. And moving on to the team that I think a lot of people have crowned as the main competition for the Dallas Cowboys, the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, the Philadelphia Eagles managed to make the playoffs last year with a 9-8 record. See, for everybody who has, said that I've been disrespectful to teams by giving them a 9-8 record, it's a good record. It can get you into the playoffs in certain divisions and certain conferences. Maybe not this year, but it's not a bad record. It's not a bad record whatsoever. Now, they did lose in the wild card round, but in fairness, it must be said that they went up against Tom Brady. And I don't think, regardless of who your quarterback is, what team you are, going up against Tom Brady in the playoffs is never a fun draw for anyone. Now, this is what I will say about the Philadelphia Eagles and why there is a renewed sense of optimism in the Philadelphia Eagles franchise. They had an amazing offseason. In fact, I would argue that they are probably within the three best off seasons in the entire NFL in terms of what teams did. I'd probably say it's them, the Raiders, and another team we'll get to in due time. And we have to start off by talking about probably their biggest acquisition, A.J. Brown. Now, full disclosure, because I have seen in the comments that there are people accusing me of being a Raiders fan. I'm actually a Titans fan. So I can talk a little bit to A.J. Brown. I'm not going to be one of those people that have flipped on A.J. since the trade, because I know a lot have. I firmly believe A.J. Brown is either a top 15, top 10 wide receiver. I don't know why there are so many people saying that he's overrated or whatnot. He's a good player, and I don't think he's the best wide receiver the Titans ever had, but he is one of the best that we've ever had. And he's going to be a huge, huge piece for this Philadelphia Eagles team. He and Jalen Hurts have that camaraderie, and I think this is going to be a real test for him as well. The Titans had Derrick Henry, who they would lean on, and they would really only go to him on those big plays, but now he's going to be asked to do a little bit more. And I think this is a perfect fit for him. Again, I think this division is competitive enough to where he's going to get to show out. And we're really going to see how good A.J. Brown is. And again, I'm one of those people who firmly believes A.J. Brown is a fantastic wide receiver and a fantastic player. So he's going to be a big pickup for them. Hassan Reddick, I think, is one of the more underrated gets for them as well. I mean, he is a great edge rusher. He was really good on the Panthers. I was sort of shocked that the Panthers just sort of let him walk like that, especially knowing they only had the 6th pick in the first round, and they were not going to take an edge rusher. So knowing that they let him walk is a little surprising. But if I'm an Eagles fan, I'm really happy I got someone like Hassan Reddick because he's relatively still on the younger side, and he's going to be a great, great defensive player for them for years to come. And now let's talk about the draft, because while I said the Eagles only won the offseason, they also did magnificent in the draft. Again, the drafts where they acquired A.J. Brown. I should have mentioned that earlier. But they also got Jordan Davis. And to put it into context, Fletcher Cox was released and then re-signed this offseason. And Jordan Davis, I don't think, will ever be the type of player that Fletcher Cox is. But if there is any player that has the potential to be a top 10, top 5 in previous years defensive tackle in the league, it's Jordan Davis. He has all the tools. He has the weight, the build, everything you would want from a big-time defensive tackle. And, I mean, it's a dream fit because Fletcher Cox maybe has 1 or 2 years left in the NFL period, and then it's going to be Jordan Davis's time to shine in Philadelphia. And that's why I think they will win an additional game this year is again, a lot of other teams got better, but I think that the overall Philadelphia Eagles really built upon what they had. The biggest question for them is going to be Jalen Hurts, and I think that Hurts is going to ball out this year. Again, he has so many new weapons. He has a lot riding on them, and again, I think their defense is good. Their offense has gotten a lot better. I'm expecting big things from the Philadelphia Eagles, and I think if you're an Eagles fan, I would be highly, highly optimistic for this upcoming season. Up next, we have the Washington Commanders. And the biggest piece of news for the Commanders, arguably, is the fact that they have a new name. They went from being the Washington football team to the Washington Commanders this offseason. Not the most exciting rebrand in history, but it's a rebrand nonetheless. Now, the Commanders are an interesting team because the accumulation of defensive players they have on their team is it's mind-boggling. They have some of the best defensive players in the NFL, but their offense is always subpar. It's something that is, it's living proof that, the old adage that defense wins championships, while that is true, you have to have at least something on offense. They remind me a lot of the Chicago Bears a few years ago where Khalil Mack was leading the pack, but they have an even better defense than that. And again, they just have not had a quarterback, sort of similar to the Broncos, except they have a much better defense than the Broncos ever had. And so they went 7-10 last year. They missed the playoffs, and their first big move of the offseason was an attempt to fill that quarterback void by getting Carson Wentz from the Indianapolis Colts. Now, you've heard what I've said about the Indianapolis Colts, and you've heard what I've said about Matt Ryan on the Indianapolis Colts. Carson Wentz is not the answer for them long term. In fact, I don't think Carson Wentz is that big of an upgrade over Taylor Heinicke, who will now be the backup quarterback. And in fact, I think that Carson Wentz is going to be more mistake-prone than Taylor Heinicke ever was as the starter in Washington. And if I am a Commanders fan, I'm not feeling too good about this. I'm really not. I don't know quite how to wrap my head around it, especially with what they gave up for him, and especially, how quickly the Colts dropped him. There was a reason. I mean, there was a time where nobody knew what quarterback the Colts were going to get, but people thought it was going to be Marcus Mariota or another quarterback because they were just so quick to drop Carson Wentz off to the Washington Commanders. And maybe he'll prove me wrong, but I'm not buying, Carson Wentz as a starting quarterback for the Commanders. They got Andrew Norrell from the Jaguars, which I will say that's a good pickup. He's a good offensive guard. He's a little bit on the older side now, but again, a good pickup. He's going to give Carson Wentz some added protection. In the draft, they got Jahan Dotson. Now, I think Jahan Dotson is probably your best pickup this offseason, not only because he gives them a legitimate second or third wide receiver, but there's a lot of questions about Terry McLaurin. I don't think they're going to trade Terry McLaurin, to be completely honest. I know there's a lot of rumors about Terry McLaurin getting shopped around and potentially being traded. I don't think that's going to happen. In the event it does, though, I do think Jahan Dotson has the potential to be a very good wide receiver. I think this wide receiver draft class is amazing. I will say I do think Jahan and Treylon Burks are the two that have the highest likelihood of not working out. But Jahan Dotson, you just can't you can't easily find another wide receiver with his athleticism. And maybe that will be a interesting dynamic between Wentz and Jahan Dotson. If you're a Commanders fan, I definitely think that's what you're hoping, but I really don't know how to work out. But I do hope for Jahan Dotson's sake that things do work out and that they end up keeping Terry McLaurin, because I think a two-headed monster of McLaurin and Dotson moving forward is a very good one to have. Now, overall, I do see them winning one fewer game, this year, just because some of the teams that they are going up against got a lot better. Like, yes, I think they'll lose to the Detroit Lions. I think they will lose one to the New York Giants. But I do think they'll end up winning one against the Eagles. I think they'll have a few surprising wins, such as like against the San Francisco 49ers. I do think they will end up beating the Eagles twice. Now, I could easily see them losing at least one of those games, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt just because I could easily see, Jalen Hurts going up against a great defense having a lot of issues. So if I'm a Commanders fan, I'm hoping for the best, but I'm predicting the worst. And our last team in the NFC East is the New York Giants. And I feel bad for Giants fans. I feel bad for New York sports fans in general, but particularly Giants fans. Y'all just can't seem to catch a break. It seems like everything always goes wrong. And it's an uphill battle. They changed their personnel this offseason, and I actually think they had a relatively good draft, but we are going to have to wait and see how everything turns out. And I can just go ahead and say right now, their upcoming season is not one that is going to be very good. It's really not. It's going to be a transition year. It's going to be a learning year. But I do think, and I'll get to this at the end, that there is a very hopeful thing for them that, again, I'll get to at the very end. Now, again, 4-13, missed the playoffs. Let's get into what they did in the offseason. Their two biggest pickups were in the first round, and let's start off with Kayvon Thibodeau. It's very interesting because the Giants drafted two players who, at a time, could have been the first overall pick. If you go back to pre-college football season, Kayvon Thibodeau was easily the first overall pick in the NFL draft. If you go to the start of the offseason, Evan Neal was easily considered the first overall pick in the NFL draft. And they got both of them. And I think both of these are actually huge pickups for them. I think Kayvon Thibodeau is going to be a excellent edge rusher for them. And I don't know why he fell the way he did. I don't buy into all of this stuff that, he didn't care about football and yada, yada, yada. I just never bought into that. I think he's going to be great, and I think he will be seen as one of the players that will help lead the New York Giants moving forward. And Evan Neal, a guy of his size, you just really can't go wrong with it. He's going to have some growing pains, of course, but overall, I think that he is going to be a fantastic player moving forward. And again, I think that they're going to look back at this past draft. They're going to be really thrilled with those two players in the first round. They had a decent draft overall. Now, I did want to bring this player up they acquired this offseason, just because I think it'll be interesting to see this dynamic, is Tyrod Taylor. Now, Tyrod Taylor is known as being the bridge quarterback. He has started many great NFL careers, unfortunately by getting injured and then backup quarterback stepping in and taking over. But he's a serviceable quarterback. And I don't know if their plan is to start him over Daniel Jones. If I were the coach, I would, but that is why I am merely talking to you about the NFL, and I am not hired to be making these coaching decisions. So if I were a New York Giants fan, I think it'd be interesting to see what happens, because I think Tyrod Taylor has the play style of a more modern NFL quarterback. And I think that he could easily be a preview of upcoming attractions. And what I mean by that is the one thing that is good for the New York Giants that I will say is your first round pick, you're going to get a high first round pick again. And the quarterback class this coming year is very good. It's very good. And I think if you had to pick an opportune time to finish with a below average record, it would be now. And I mean, again, 2-15 is not great. Maybe there are games against the Jaguars, Seahawks, and Lions that you can win, maybe even the Texans. I don't think so. But again, you're going to get a great quarterback. And there could be 5, even 7 quarterbacks taken in this upcoming draft within the first round. And if I'm the Giants, I'm looking at my team right now and I'm saying, you know what? We're not going to be good this season. We're not going to be good next season. But give us maybe 3 or 4 more years, and we're going to be good as long as these young players progress and turn out the way we want them to. Things are going to be great. So, Giants fans, I'm sorry that this season is probably going to be another dud, but a bright future is ahead. And now let's get into my top 5 NFC East offensive players. My number 5 offensive player is the new Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver, A.J. Brown. 63 receptions, 869 yards, 5 touchdowns, a 13.8 average yard per catch, and an 84.4 grade from PFF. Again, I think A.J. Brown is a top 15, top 10 caliber wide receiver. I think that there's going to be a lot of growing pains, specifically with Jalen Hurts learning how to feed him the ball and really being the main focal point at the wide receiver position for his team. But I think he's going to have a fantastic year. I think after this coming year, anybody who had doubts that A.J. Brown is a top wide receiver in the NFL is going to be, they're going to have their eyes opened. And that is why he comes in at my number 5 offensive player in the NFC East. My number 4 offensive player is Terry McLaurin, wide receiver, Washington Commanders. 77 receptions, 1,053 yards, 5 touchdowns, and a 13.7 average yards per catch, the 78.3 grade from PFF. As I said, McLaurin, it was a toss-up between whether or not to put McLaurin or A.J. Brown on top of each other. But I ended up going with McLaurin just because I think he has been considered a top 10 wide receiver longer and he's more solidified. I don't know if he'll be on the Commanders by the end of the season, but regardless, I think he is going to be one of the main reasons the Commanders win games. I mean, he's going to have to be. And until he proves me wrong, he's still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL and one of the best in the entire NFC. And that is why he comes in at my number 4 spot. And my number 3 offensive player is Dallas Goedert, tight end, Philadelphia Eagles. 56 receptions, 830 yards, 4 touchdowns, 14.8 average yards per catch, an 88.9 grade from PFF. Once Zach Ertz got traded, Dallas Goedert stepped up, and I think he showed everybody exactly why they traded away Zach Ertz. He has easily become a top 10 tight end. I hesitated saying top 5, but I think he could easily get into the top 5 conversation this year. If he had been the main tight end earlier, I easily think he would have reached a 1,000-yard season. 830 is not bad for a tight end by any means, and I think he's only going to improve this season now that he's going to be a much bigger part of the Eagles' offense. That's exactly why I have him as my 3rd best player. My number 2 best offensive player in the NFC East is CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver, Dallas Cowboys. 79 receptions, 1,102 yards, 6 touchdowns, 13.9 average yards per catch, and an 84.3 grade from PFF. CeeDee Lamb, as I said, he's a top 10 wide receiver. He showed us that last year, and he's going to be the number 1 target on the Dallas Cowboys. And I think this year he's going to prove that he might not only be top 10, he might be top 5. He's the focal point of the Cowboys offense from Dak Prescott's player personnel perspective. And the only thing keeping him from number 1 is that I think there's going to be a certain player that has a bounce back year this year. But that takes nothing away from CD. He's going to be the best wide receiver in the AFC East, or NFC East, excuse me, and that's why he is my second best offensive player. And my number one offensive player in the NFC East is Dak Prescott, quarterback, Dallas Cowboys. 4,449 passing yards, 37 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, a 54.6 QBR, and an 83.8 grade from PFF. Now, he did not have his best year last year, but he didn't have an awful year. And he was coming off an injury, and he was learning how to play with the new players that the Cowboys got on offense. And I think this year is going to be a bounce back year for him. I really do. I think that the only way they go 12-5 is that Dak Prescott steps up and proves that he is still a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. Maybe he's top 15 if you want to argue that. I think he's top 10. And I think he's going to be the best offensive player in the NFC East. And that is why he is at my number one spot. Now let's go ahead and move on to my top 5 defensive players in the NFC East. My number 5 best defensive player in the NFC East is Kendall Fuller, cornerback, Washington Commanders. 64 tackles, 1 interception, 16 passes defended, and an 81.5 grade from PFF. Now, despite the fact that I said the Commanders are not going to be a very good team next year, you're about to see a lot of their defensive players make this list because, as I said, the accumulation of defensive players that the Commanders were able to get on the defensive side of the football is outstanding. And Kendall Fuller is one of them. I think that he has surprisingly gone under the radar in terms of NFL cornerbacks, primarily because he's been on the Washington team. But I think he is still a good player, and when you go up against gunslingers like Jalen Hurts and Dak Prescott, you're going to need a guy like Kendall Fuller, and that's exactly why he is my number 5 defensive player in the NFC East. My number 4 best defensive player in the NFC East is DeMarcus Lawrence, defensive end, Dallas Cowboys. 16 tackles, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 1 interception, and a 91 overall grade from PFF. DeMarcus Lawrence in many other divisions would be the best defensive player, and that's saying something since he's number 4 on my list. He's been the best defensive player on the Dallas Cowboys for a long time. He's no longer the best defensive player. I think you probably know where this list is going since I said that. But he's still up there. As I said, there were the 3-headed monster of DeMarcus Lawrence, Randy Gregory, and Micah Parsons last year. Now they're just a 2-headed monster, but DeMarcus Lawrence is still a part of why the Dallas Cowboys defense is a great unit, and that is why he is at my number 4 defensive player in the NFC East. My number 3 defensive player in the NFC East is Jonathan Allen, defensive tackle, Washington Commanders. 31 solo tackles, 9 sacks, and an 84.9 grade from PFF. Now, Jonathan Allen, depending on what position you put other players in the NFC in, is arguably the best defensive tackle. Again, there's another dude who we'll end up talking about when we start talking about the NFC West, which we'll get to in a few weeks here. But Jonathan Allen, I think, has flown under the radar. He's a very good player. And again, he's one of the reasons why the Commanders have one of the better defensive units in the entire NFL. Now, these next 2 players we're about to get to are household names, and they're deserving of being the number 2 and number 1 spots, respectively. But Jonathan Allen is also deserving of being the number 3 best defensive player in the NFC East. My second best defensive player in the NFC East is Chase Young, defensive end, Washington Commanders. 15 solo tackles, 1.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and a 75.1 grade from PFF. Now, Chase Young was injured last year, and I think a lot of people forgot how good of a player he really is. He is one of the best defensive players, not only here in the NFC East, but in the entire NFL. He's one of the better edge rushers, and I think he's going to have a huge comeback year this year. Again, as I've said many times in this video, unfortunately, the Commanders' offense is the exact opposite of their defense. But Chase Young is, again, he's just like I said about DeMarcus Lawrence. In many other divisions, he would easily be the best defensive player. But there's just one player who's a little bit better than him. But by no means am I saying that Chase Young is undeserving of the number 2 spot. And my number 1 defensive player in the NFC East is Micah Parsons, linebacker, Dallas Cowboys. 64 solo tackles, 13 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and an 89.8 grade from PFF. And that was him as a rookie. Micah Parsons is arguably the best linebacker in the NFL, and he is the best player on the Dallas Cowboys. And there's a reason why they're going to be the best team in the NFC East. A big reason is going to be because of him. And I think he's going to have a incredible season this upcoming season. And I think he's going to solidify himself as potentially, by the time his career ends, one of the better defensive players to play, not only for the Dallas Cowboys, but in the NFL. And with that being said, I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Again, let's keep the comments coming. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And next week, we'll be talking about everyone's favorite, the NFC West. Or excuse me, the NFC North, not the NFC West yet. So I'll see you next week when we talk about Aaron Rodgers and his good friends in the NFC North. See you then.